Hi, thanks for joining us today. This is the session of the Inequality by the Numbers workshop, where we're going to be talking about inequality in New York City. So I'm going to try and do a couple of things in my half hour. Talk about trends in income inequality in New York City over the past 35 years or so, and also spend a little bit of time looking at the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on New York City, its communities, and its effect on inequality. Let me pull up my screen here. There we go. Okay, James Parrott is my name. I'm the Director of Fiscal and Economic Policies at the Center for New York City Affairs at the New School. I'm going to touch on three things today. I'm going to look at sources and trends behind income inequality in New York City. I'll be looking at the past decade, the pre-pandemic, post-Great Recession decade of the 2010s, where we saw rising incomes for the bottom half of the income distribution. And finally, talk about a new strain of inequality with massive pandemic-related job losses in New York City. We start with the classic Emmanuel Saez 1% share of income chart for the United States over the past century or so. This is based on income tax data, including capital gains. I divided the graph here into three sections. The previous peak was reached in 1929, and then you can see the 1% share receding through the Great Depression and World War II, followed by around 35 years from 1945 to 1980 roughly of remarkable stability in the 1% share at around 10% over that period. That stability ended in the 1970s, and the 1% share generally has risen since then, returning to the 1929 peak of 22% or so in 2007, and then it stayed roughly in the 20 to 22% range since then. The middle section of the chart shows this period 45 to 80 or so of a semblance of shared prosperity, where broad-based economic growth in the United States, the incomes of the 1% certainly rose in real terms over this period, but their share didn't rise relative to the rest of the economy. And this was the golden age, so to speak, of the white middle class in the United States, with rising incomes and growing numbers of people in the middle. I say it's a semblance of shared prosperity because, of course, it left out African Americans and most people of color and most women who were not part of married couple families. What changed around 1980? Well, it's not the focus of my talk today, but it's not internationalization of the economy, globalization, or technology per se, but policies changed. Class-conscious policies propagated by the 1% from the national level down. And we'll see the local manifestation of those in New York City to some extent. I think, a very accessible treatment of this policy change situation is the book by Jacob Hacker and Paul Pearson, The Winner-Take-All Politics. We take the last third of that 1% share chart and look at it here in more detail with New York City data included in that in red, the top bar. And you can see that the 1% share is higher throughout this period in New York City, although it started, roughly around the same 10 or 12% level as at the US at the beginning of this period. And then it's generally risen in the United States, but has risen more in New York City. The 1% share in the city peaked at about 44% in 2007. Let me see if I can get the video moved here a little bit so you can see the movement in recent years, where it's been up and down in the 35 to 40% range. So it stayed high, but it's interesting that it hasn't kept rising. Of course, this data only goes through 2016. We expect that it might have risen in the past couple of years, but it's also possible that the government tax data is just not reflecting as well as accurately the annual incomes of people when they're rising into the hundreds of millions of dollars. Of course, there's less incentive to report all the income if there's no consequence if you underreport on your taxes for the most part for very high income people. Now, what accounts for New York City's higher income concentration? Some of the usual suspects are a very large finance sector. New York City is the capital of capitalism and the financial capital of the United States and beyond. Most likely, it's a large corporate headquarters and a lot of professional services, legal services, accounting, management consulting, and so on. A lot of inherited and new wealth in New York City, and real estate is a big factor here. And I want to say a little bit more about that because the real estate doesn't I don't think it gets equal time with these other factors in discussions of income inequality, and yet it's a very prevalent factor at a local level. Private landowners have been able to capture the tremendous appreciation in land values in a place like Manhattan, where land values are very high. Often the increase in land values has been intensified or boosted by public actions for rezonings. And there's been a transition over the last 30 to 50 years from from extensive manufacturing uses, light manufacturing uses in New York City to more commercial activities. And that goes for Manhattan as well, which used to be the home of several 100,000 garment manufacturing jobs, but also jobs in electronics manufacturing and printing and other manufacturing sectors. No longer. And then another factor to consider in terms of what accounts for the more pronounced income polarization in New York City is restrictive zoning practices, residential zoning practices in the suburbs around New York City, which has concentrated low-income households in New York City, as well as other center cities around the country. Let's look for a moment at the composition of the 1% income in New York City. So when you think of all the incomes received by the 1%, wages are the biggest portion of that, represented about 36%, and about 25% each from capital gains and business income, and then dividends and interest were the remaining 12%. And then if you look at the 1% share of different forms of income in New York City, overall they have 36% of all income, 18% of wage income, very high percent of dividends and interest and business income, 70% dividends and interest, 71% of all business income, and 86% of realized capital gains, reflecting the fact that stock ownership and high valued land, which also generates realized capital gains, are very highly, the ownership of those assets is very highly concentrated in New York City and most places. there's an interesting story to be told. We will only have time to just scratch the surface of that today in terms of relating changes in the structure of the city's economy post 1980 to key income metrics, and also to think about how the changes in the structure of the economy were affected by policy choices, mainly at the national level, but to some extent at the local level as well. And it would be even more interesting to be able, if we had more time, to look at those income changes in terms of significant racial, ethnic, and immigration changes in New York City since 1980. We're going to do a very little bit of that today, but again, just scratching the surface on that. 1980 is also a significant historical juncture for New York City, since it marks the transition away from the worst of the city's 1975 fiscal crisis, which was very much also an economic crisis related to broad changes in the location of economic activity in the United States, a response to civil unrest in New York City and other large cities around the country in the late 1960s, and a very significant outmigration of both corporate headquarters and corporate jobs from New York City to the suburbs and to the south in the early and mid 1970s, and then a pretty steady outmigration of the white middle class from New York City. Kim Phillips Fine is a political science professor at CUNY, and she's written a very interesting book called Fear City about the politics of the 1970s fiscal crisis in New York City. She details the attack on New York City's liberal order and expansive government, and makes a very convincing argument that there was nothing inevitable about the austerity response that played out in New York City to the fiscal crisis. It was a result of choices made at the national level and in New York City and in Albany. And in many ways, the politics of the fiscal crisis represent the local manifestation of the Washington offensive that set in place the policy regime enabling income polarization, the story told in Hacker and Pearson's books. So here's a list of some of the key economic changes that I think were critical in shaping the city's economy in the post-1980 period. Financial deregulation. These, of course, are not limited to New York City. It played out, across the United States, but had a pretty substantial impact, if not disproportionate, in New York City. Financial deregulation and the rise of financialization and the control over the economy of financial institutions, largely headquartered in New York City. Globalization, increased foreign investment, and not regulating trade. A lot of these policy choices are represented decision not to take affirmative action to change these policies, but to allow them to unfold in a way that benefited private market actors. Letting barriers to unionization remain is one of those. Policy drift that David Wild has so expertly documented in his book on fissuring of the workplace. And we saw that there were not significant policy responses at any level of government to the corporate actions that characterize this fissuring, allowing the minimum wage to falter, and also fostering economic competition among the states, which has certainly had a major impact in New York City and in many parts of the North, as well as all over the country, in terms of corporations basically blackmailing local policymakers over their jobs and where they're going to be located, and extracting tax breaks and economic concessions from state and local governments as state and local governments competed for the favors of private investment and the location of jobs. Again, looking at the real estate dimension of this, the New York City version of that story illustrates the elevation of a market rationality above all else. It essentially views the cityscape as owned by private interest, and landowners arguing for zoning changes to allow the highest and best use. That was an argument that effectively doomed manufacturing jobs and industrial activities in Manhattan and in many parts of the Bronx and Brooklyn and Queens as well, that had long been the backbone of the city's economy and working class. And this change in this broad scale change in land use led to the creation of ever greater fortunes by big developers who were able to capture all of the appreciation in land values. The city never really sought to do rezonings in a way that would allow the public sector to benefit from the appreciation in land values, except to the extent that it enriched the property tax base, and the city collected property taxes based on rising appreciation. What I want to do now in the next few slides is take one metric as representative of income trends in New York City in recent decades, and look at how these changed over time, and do a little bit in terms of looking at the racial and ethnic dimension of that, and talking just very briefly about the relationship of these income changes to broader changes in the economy. So I use here median family income by family in New York City, looking at it by race, the race and ethnicity of the head of the household. And we look at the decennial census years, 1980, 90, and so on, ending in 2018. That's the most recent year for which we have census data from the ACS. You see in the yellow shaded bars here the growth over each of these decade-long or almost decade-long periods, and how that's fluctuated quite a bit. Pretty significant 20.5% increase in the 1980s. Now keep in mind that 1980 was the end of a decade, the decade of the 70s, which was a decade of severe economic contraction. So to some extent, those starting income levels might have been on the low side because of this extended period of economic decline. Nonetheless, there was a pretty significant economic expansion, partially fueled by a booming commercial real estate sector and unleashed financial sector lending practices and debt creation practices that created great incomes and wealth in New York City. And then in the I'll say a little bit more in the next slide about the 1990s and the 2000s. And then interestingly, in the past decade, since 2010, also a pretty significant growth in inflation-adjusted median family incomes of around 20% over that period as well. And we'll talk about the racial and ethnic differences as we go along. So here, in focusing on looking first at the decade of the 1980s, now keep in mind, this was a decade after we saw a significant decline in New York City population from the outmigration of a large segment of the white middle class. So when the economy did recover in the 1980s, it created economic openings for people of color in New York City. And so they were able to capture some of the job growth in the corporate sector, and New York City, which had the city government, which had downsized about 50,000 jobs in the fiscal crisis period, as the city's economy improved in the 1980s, was able to add back many of those jobs. So African Americans and Latinx people were able to garner many of those openings in the public sector as well. So you see, interestingly, you see stronger income gains for Black families in the 1980s than for white families. Although keep in mind that the starting income levels were much lower for families of color than for white families. Following the following decades, there were income declines for all families overall in New York City in the 90s and 2000s, and for the most part, worse declines for Black and Latinx families and Asian families, particularly in the 1990s. This was a period of significant corporate downsizing of administrative and middle management jobs in the 1990s. Then the first decade of this century saw a continued boom on Wall Street that mostly bypassed persons of color, and real wages stagnated over both of these decades. There was not a lot of net job growth from 1989 to 2008, and much of the job growth that did take place was in low-paying service jobs, in retail, tourism-related jobs, home health care, other healthcare jobs, social services, personal services, and so on. Lower and moderate income paying jobs. Then since 2010, we've seen very strong net job growth and diversification away from Wall Street, and most importantly, a doubling of the minimum wage, which we'll come back to with a chart in a little bit, that lifted incomes for a lot of people in the bottom half of the income distribution. So that's a quick overview of income trends by families. You're probably wondering how did the composition of families by race and ethnicity change over this period? So this slide shows that and shows very clearly the declining share of white families in New York City from a little over half in 1980 to about a third in recent years. A fairly stable, slightly declining in the recent period, Black share at around 22%. Latinx share growing from around 20% in 1980 to 28%, and a very sharp rise in the Asian and all other category from 3.6% in 1880 to 18% in 2010. This chart shows median family incomes for families of color relative to whites over this period since 1980. And you can see that for Black and Latino families, that has roughly been in the 50 to 60% range, 50 to 60% of white family, median family incomes. And that situation hasn't improved very much over that time, although in the past decade, some improvement for Black families. Now, let's talk more about the last decade, because it's been a different kind of growth, although underlying problems still persist. Move my picture here. So real wage and income growth for the bottom half of the income distribution and for many workers of color. First time since the 1960s that economic growth in New York City has not been heavily dominated by Wall Street. Wall Street is still a very significant factor in the city's economy, but but hasn't played the overriding dominant role that it played in the late 1980s and the 90s and 2000s, culminating in the financial crash of 2007, 2008. Still, the financial bailout of Wall Street was near complete, and Wall Street did very well as a result of that. But other things have been happening in the city's economy so that it's not as exclusively dependent upon Wall Street as it was. There's been some progress in extending labor protections, but at the state level, at the city level, regulation of fast food workers, a higher minimum wage for fast food workers. The $15 minimum wage was first implemented for fast food workers, then a year later started to be phased in for other workers. But still significant growth in the gig economy and a fraying of the worker safety net. So the state unemployment and workers' comp systems haven't really seen significant improvements in the last decade. Quality of life has improved, and crime has remained low in most neighborhoods, but housing segregation and school segregation in the early grades continues, and rents and real estate values have risen. City actions, the city rezoned a lot of land in the 2000s under Bloomberg. De Blasio has continued that practice with a lot of rezonings, but not done in a way that really preserves affordable housing and allows most of the gains of the appreciation in land values to accrue to private real estate owners. Before the pandemic set in, we had historically low unemployment levels, with unemployment around 4% for the last 2 or 3 years. Historically very low over this period of time. Let's move over there. The most significant development, I think, was the substantial increase in the minimum wage in New York State, effectively doubled over a period of 5 years. In 2013, when the state first acted to start raising its minimum wage above the federal level, New York was still at the $7.25 federal level. You can see here how it rose over the years. In 2016, the state acted to start phasing in the $15 minimum wage. So that first occurred in New York City at the very end of 2018. So between 2013 and 2019, a more than doubling in the minimum wage. And that pretty directly affects the wages received by the bottom third of the workforce. And then some portion of workers above that benefit from spillover and wage compression effects. So this has meant significant wage improvements for people at the bottom, which are clearly indicated in this chart, which shows decile wage changes by deciles of the wage distribution for 2 periods, 2009 to 13, and then the last 5 years, which we had data here, 2013 to 18. So the red bars are the early part of that period, and that shows, that's the more typical picture where real incomes are stagnating or declining for people in the bottom half of the distribution, some increases in the upper half. Last 5 years, a different picture, much sustained increases throughout the bottom half of the income of the wage distribution. 15% real increase at the 20th percentile wage. Of course, people at the 90th percentile, doing even better. That's more the usual case. But pretty substantial increases here. And you can see that in race and ethnic terms in this slide. And here, to keep it simple, we looked at the second decile, the median, and the eighth decile as an indication of a low-wage worker, a typical worker in the middle, and a typical sort of worker toward the top at the eighth decile. And you can see Black workers at all of these 3 points in the wage distribution doing fairly well in this period, and the second decile and the median Black worker doing better than their white counterparts, and Latinx workers also doing a little better than their white counterparts over this period. So again, the growth in wages has been better for Blacks and Latinx, but keep in mind that their wage levels are lower to start with. I don't want to give the impression that this has been, you know, a golden age for the economy overall. There's still very, you know, very persistent structural and long-term problems here, and just, you know, here are just 3 indicators of that. But in the interest of time, let me not spend too much time on that. But other than just to note the first one, that, for example, if about 23% of New York City residents lived in poverty in 2016, over you know, any 2 or 3 year period, many families enter or leave poverty, so that the total number of families that have experienced poverty over a 3 year period is about twice what the poverty rate otherwise is. Let me turn now in the last few minutes to talk about this new strain of inequality with the COVID-19 pandemic. This is from the cover of a report that I released with a colleague at the New School back in mid-April, where we projected that by the end of April, New York City would see the loss of 1.2 million jobs. It's about 25% of the total, heavily concentrated among persons of color in industries characterized by largely face-to-face interactions, local service-oriented industries in accommodation and restaurants and local retail and so on. A very disproportionate kind of impact, not like a typical recession at all, where you see job losses dispersed across the economy. A very a pronounced concentration of job losses in lower paying sectors, lighter job losses so far in higher paying sectors in the finance sector, professional services, information management consulting, and so on. This chart shows the incidence of COVID-19 cases in New York City, with the darker colors meaning higher density of cases. And these tend to be, you see a lot in the Bronx here and a lot in Queens and on the North Shore of Staten Island. These are lower income areas of the city and so on. And a lot of the economic hardship has also been concentrated in these same areas, as opposed to, you know, parts of Manhattan around Central Park. So again, the pandemic job losses are very different. In the report, we look at 3 categories of jobs: the face-to-face jobs and the local services, essential public health, safety and sustenance jobs, and healthcare, and public safety jobs, and the food distribution chain, and so on. And then those jobs that we refer to as remote jobs, mainly professional and managerial jobs that can be done remotely, where people have been inconvenienced, certainly, you know, it's some at public health risk, but by and large, people who have kept their jobs, kept their salaries, kept their benefits, and so on, and not experiencing anything like the hardship concentrated at the lower income, low end of the income distribution. 85% of job losses in mostly low-wage face-to-face industries. 2/3 of job losses, we estimate, among persons of color. 2/3 among those earning less than $40,000 a year, only 10% of job losses among those earning $100,000 or more. Over half of the job losses among immigrants, with nearly 200,000 among undocumented workers who are not eligible, by the way, for any form of federal economic assistance or not eligible for unemployment insurance. Over a third of all young adults between 18 and 24 lost jobs. So this doesn't bode well for a lot of low and moderate income CUNY students or others who are trying to make their way in a very high cost New York City. The job market outlook for them is on the bleak side, to put it mildly. And of course, with 1 million or more people losing jobs, a lot of people are going to be losing health insurance over this period as well. The city began to reopen recently on June the 8th. And we can see so far that many of these jobs are not quickly going to return, and unemployment's going to stay high. My sense is it will stay in the 15% or higher range for many months, possibly through the end of this year. And work and business practices have to accommodate social distancing. So a lot of these jobs in the face-to-face service and restaurant and retail industries are not going to return, and these businesses will be operating at much less than 100% of capacity. And many of them have such tight margins that they won't be able to survive for very long, operating much below 100%. So we expect to see significant business closures as well. The $600 a week supplemental unemployment insurance benefits are due to expire on July 31st. Doesn't seem as though Republicans in Congress are inclined to extend those benefits. And as I pointed out, undocumented workers are not eligible for most forms of economic assistance from the federal government, and a significant number of them are still without jobs. This is clearly a case where more federal action, economic assistance is needed, and I believe the extent of unemployment will be so persistent, by late summer and early fall, that there will be, an active public discussion on the need for job creation and public works programs at a national level. There are things that can be done at a local level to try and make the situation a little bit better, but mainly changes in labor policies that will serve low-income workers better over the next few years as the economy does eventually recover. In the meantime, we need to minimize budget cuts through progressive and business taxation at the state level. We saw how hard-pressed many independent contract workers had become when the economy shut down in March. So New York State should enact an ABC test, as California did, to clarify the employment status of workers long considered to be independent contractors by the businesses that they work for. We need to improve access and benefit levels for state unemployment insurance and workers' comp, and start to address in a more serious and thoroughgoing way health and housing inequities and pay inequities. Of course, this public health situation raises questions about the future of dense cities like New York City. We saw a similar concern, similar in some respects, concern after 9/11, when there was concern about whether or not businesses would want to operate in dense cities that might be targets for terrorist attacks, and whether or not people would want to live in those cities and so on. And yet, within a few years, we saw that New York City's resilience really play out, and how New York City expanded, fairly quickly after 2 or 3 years had passed. So, I expect that there will be we will figure out how to deal with, hopefully we'll learn from the mistakes in dealing with this public health crisis, learn how to deal with those more effectively going forward, and the productivity benefits of dense concentrations of economic activity that make possible face-to-face interactions, and the cultural attractions of large cities will resurface, and New York City will be desirable once again, and attract. It will be desirable for people to stay here and expand. And of course, a lot of people of moderate and modest income means are not contemplating going anyplace else. So the city should really concentrate on improving the quality of life for the people who are here now. And one thing we need to avoid doing is providing subsidies for real estate developers, as has been the city's response to the 1970s fiscal crisis, our response to in the post 9/11 environment as well. So there are many things that can be done at a local level to improve the labor market policies and regulation, and to improve the control of real estate and the availability of affordable housing that can ensure an affordable and livable and more equitable city. So let me stop at that point. Thank you. If you do have questions, I think I have here's some other publications you might be interested in. My email address is parrottj@newschool.edu. Thank you.